I'm testifying in favor of House Bill 1424 and on my own behalf. I'm a family physician in Texas. I no longer practice clinical medicine. I work in a non-clinical capacity at this time. I don't think I can say everything as fluently as some of our other speakers have, but I would like to respond to some of the things that have gone before. One of the people who spoke mentioned the AMA and how physicians should follow the AMA. And I'd like to point out that the AMA is a voluntary association. It is not a licensing bureau. It's a lobbying organization that is a dues collecting organization and has insurance products and other things like that. They don't have an official capacity to set medical standards of care. And so we've heard that term talking about standard care. But I think it's very important to realize that doctors don't always agree on what standard care is or what appropriate care is. In my capacity as a family physician, there were procedures that I didn't do, or I didn't do on certain patients. If I felt someone was too young for a procedure, I wouldn't have performed it. I wouldn't have sterilized a 16-year-old patient, for example. There are a lot of areas where physicians need discretion. They need to follow their own medical judgment as well as their own conscience. And conscience is clearly the most important right that all of us have as Americans. Federal statutes, I think, are currently being watered down to, there are provisions in some of the bills being considered in Congress right now to say that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act will not apply. So even though we have that act, they're saying, no, you can't rely on that. So I urge you to pass this bill, support conscience rights, avoid discrimination against Christians and other ethical medical providers.
Questions, members? Representative Sweeter.
Thank you, Chair. Do you think that healthcare providers should be able to discriminate against which patients they treat on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity?
I think that physicians should have the right to decide how they're going to treat any patient. As a family doctor, there are some hormonal treatments, for example, that I wouldn't give to anybody. I didn't treat my male patients who thought they needed testosterone. I referred them to a urologist. If I were an endocrinologist, I would, and I wasn't, but I still think as an endocrinologist, you should have the ability to say, I'm not going to give male hormones to a patient with female organs. There are people who object to that. It's okay for them to object to that. They can, we need both sides. You shouldn't be forced to practice in a way that you disagree with. Medical practice changes over time. Back, in the early 20th century, people were treated with radiation therapy for for acne, okay? So someone who had acne got X-ray beams and later on developed skin cancer from that. The standard of care changed based on medical knowledge. So, it wouldn't have been appropriate to say, okay, you've got acne, I'm gonna give you X-ray treatment for that. That's not done anymore, but it was done in the past. So medical standards of care change. And so it's just not appropriate to require a physician to practice in a certain way.
So I think we're probably, I would presume this entire committee is in agreement that, we don't want doctors practicing outside of their comfort space with procedures they know how to do. You referenced hormone therapy. That's usually something that is quite specialized. What I'm trying to get at is, there have been some cases of you said you were a family doctor of children being turned away from pediatricians' offices because they had two parents of the same gender. And that's sort of what I'm getting at.
I just don't see how that's relevant to this bill, though.
I think a lot of folks are concerned that this bill opens the door for discrimination based on identity. So I'm wondering if you could address whether or not you think it is okay for physicians to turn patients away on the basis of who they are, not the care they're seeking.
You know, I really object to the tone of the question, frankly. I mean, you're within your rights to ask it. But I feel like a physician who's guided by ethics is, part of that ethic is going to be kindness. And you're going to find people who are unkind on both sides of any political issue. But you can't legislate kindness. But again, I don't want my conscience rights as a physician to be taken away by law.
Unfortunately, we've had some stories today of people described being treated unkindly by medical providers, which is, I think you'd agree, unfortunate. Would you support language in this bill to clarify that it doesn't allow for discrimination based on the race, sex, orientation, gender identity?
You know, I think that broad kind of language is now being used to assault conscience. And so I think you have to be very, very careful, because what we're seeing here, I mean, we've got all kinds of existing language, and that's being promoted over and over again. You know, we're going to add gender and gender identity and so on to all these things that those of us who have a Christian, I mean, Christians even disagree on this, but some people with very strongly held beliefs about certain things are being bombarded daily and told that your beliefs are wrong, you're not allowed to express them. If you express them or hold them or think them, you can't have a job in this area, you can't go to medical school. You know, I think that what we're seeing right now is those of us who come down on a different side of the popular issue feel like we're being battered.
I hear that, and I will say I think the LGBTQ community feels quite similarly.
Well, I would like to not batter them, but I don't want to be battered by my government either, or by my employer.
So what I'm wondering is, how do we provide some sense of safety for these patients that they will be able to find care? You know, as someone who has practiced family medicine, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I would not turn away a gay or transgender person who came to me for a practice, you know, something that I treated in family practice. I had lesbian and gay, and I'm not sure if I had any transgender patients. No one identified themselves that way to me, but I had lesbian and gay patients. And I think we had, you know, mutual respect. I never turned anyone away for that reason. I never had anyone leave my practice because they thought I was unkind to them.
Okay. So given that, what is the challenge with language to clarify that this bill is distinctly about procedures and that
The challenge, I think the challenge is that we're seeing so much on the other side. And like I say, there's that language. There's currently discussion at the federal level about including that language and saying that you cannot use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to, you know, to be protected by any clause of that. So.
Okay, well,
I mean, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your answers. You know, I'm still quite concerned, but I appreciate your answers.
Well, I'm in favor of this bill, and I thank you for hearing me and considering it.
Representative Oliverson.
Doctor, I appreciate you coming today, and I think you said something that I, as a medical provider, immediately connected with you, but I think it would be a benefit, since we're having this conversation anyway, and we're talking about people feeling nervous about going to see the doctor, or, you know, feeling like, you know, they're not being, treated fairly, or their views are not being respected, or their rights or whatever. You said something I strongly identify with as a Christian healthcare provider, and that is that oftentimes I hear people say, well, if you're a Christian and you don't like providing that kind of care, then you should just get the, HE double hockey sticks out of medical's, profession and go somewhere else. Have you ever heard things like that thrown at you in your medical practice, where people have basically told you that your beliefs aren't welcome here, you better leave that at the door of your house, and you better not bring that to work, and you better not express opinions on things that have to do with values and, things like that? Have you heard that as a medical provider?
Because I am older and I started my medical training and practice a long time ago, and I actually have not been in clinical practice for the last 10 years. So I think that the shift that we're seeing right now is more of a danger to young people who want to go into a healthcare profession than it was to me. When I was training, to me, the big issue was abortion and abortifacient drugs and things like that. And yet I did my OB rotation medical school at a Catholic hospital deliberately. And, so I didn't.
Why did you do that?
Pardon me?
Why did you go to a Catholic hospital for that?
Because I felt like they would support my conscience would be compatible with their practice.
You weren't worried about having them tell you otherwise, that you had to go in and do what you
Right.
were told.
Right,
And you knew that
Yeah.
because it was a Catholic hospital, there would be certain things that just wouldn't be done there,
right,
right?
right.
Totally understand where you're coming from. I've been there, seen that. We actually had to put that in law. And I mean, this is sort of weird. People don't realize that this is not all brand new, right? I've heard a couple of witnesses talk about it, but there is some specific protections with respect to physicians by themselves and elective abortion procedures. We had to put that in statute. Do you know why we had to put that in statute? We had to put that in statute because people wouldn't stop discriminating against health care providers that felt uncomfortable or felt it was immoral to offer those procedures. And so there is a role to play when it comes to the government stepping in and saying, the First Amendment, the expression of religious freedom is an important right. And we're not going to trample all over that. Just because you have a certain job or a certain profession doesn't mean you have to not be who you are at work. Now, I heard you say, and I applaud you, that a person seeking care, someone seeking care for their hypertension or diabetes, it's not relevant. I mean, at least to me, I think to you as well, what their lifestyle choices are, other than if they're eating too much, if they're diabetic and they're eating a lot of sugar, that's obviously a bad thing. If they're hypertensive and they're not watching their diet, that can be a bad thing. That's not what we're talking about. And I think
Right.
the other thing that you mentioned, and we have another bill coming up later where we will talk about this at length, but I just wanted to applaud you for stating that there are treatments that are out there, services that are being offered where the jury's in the medical arena, the jury's still very much out as to what the long-term consequences are. The jury's very much out. In fact, there are other countries where these services they're starting to do a right about face as to whether or not these kinds of services will be provided because of concerns
Right.
over the long-term health effects, right?
Oh, that's correct.
And I think people this is what I think, I heard you saying earlier. So I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I just hope that everybody that's here testifying on for or against realizes that I think what I'm hearing and what I think Representatives Wiener and I in our conversations together are hearing is that there's fear on both sides of people's, who they are, basically just being trampled underfoot. And that door swings both ways. Would you agree?
Oh, for sure.
I appreciate your
All
testimony.
right, thank you so much.